from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we are very pleased to discuss with you an important topic that, as a matter of fact, we have not discussed on this program before, and that is the issue of tenure for faculty in higher education. It has a really history that is of most importance, and so on the program we're going to talk about the evolution of that question of tenure, how it came about historically. We're going to talk about what tenure does and what it does not do for members of faculties, not only in the United States but even other countries. And we're so pleased to welcome to the program a very good friend of mine and a colleague to discuss this important question. I welcome Tom Flint. Our guest holds a bachelor's and master's degree from Colorado State University. His field is philosophy. He is a member of the faculty in the Department of Philosophy at North Idaho College. And Tom, I'll tell our viewers that I overheard you discussing this some time ago and was so impressed that I decided that we should discuss this topic. It's way overdue, and welcome to the program.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And I'm very pleased to welcome our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho and also has done research and background in this question as a law student some years ago. And I shall ask Janelle to commence today's questioning.
This is going to be a very interesting question. Tenure as a whole is oftentimes misunderstood by people. Can you tell us what it means, and then something about the history of tenure? How is it a new concept, or is it a very old concept, and somehow the way it evolved in the United States?
Sure. Tenure, I guess, as we were discussing earlier, grows out of the idea of to hold, and originally it referred to land, holding land, and then later has been applied to holding a position. And it's a relatively new development insofar as holding a position is concerned, or in education, going back actually only to the 1920s. But tenure is inseparable from the concept of academic freedom, which is actually a new term for a very ancient concept. So in order to understand tenure, we have to understand a little bit about the development of the idea of academic freedom, which originates in ancient Greece with Platonic Academy, Plato's Academy, where the desire to question, debate, research, and report on ideas was a fundamental value and hallmark of the Platonic Academy, and which values were also carried on in Aristotle's Lyceum. And of course, in Western civilization, the classical Greek tradition is lost for a long time. But when in the Renaissance that classical tradition was retrieved essentially from Arab culture, the medieval universities of Paris and Cambridge and Oxford were patterned on the classical model. And a big value with those universities was the concept of free inquiry or academic freedom. There were certain limitations due to the nature of the times. Areas like philosophy and theology were somewhat restricted. You were free to pursue your own interests and your own inquiry and speech about those things so long as you didn't trespass on the doctrinal authority of the church. So philosophy and theology were somewhat constrained in those regards, but law, science, medicine, grammar and rhetoric were pretty much free to pursue interests as people saw fit. And then during the colonial American period, those universities were the models for the establishment of American universities like Harvard and William and Mary. However, there was a pretty big difference in the early American universities as opposed to the medieval European ones, largely in that with establishing new societies, often on the basis of different religious groups, you had a large issue as to what the role of higher education was. Was it to essentially indoctrinate young people into the social and religious values of the colonial American period, or was it more along the lines of the European model to expose young people to a variety of different perspectives and points of view and controversies, to, in the classical sense of educate, to lead them out, so that they could understand the world and be able to better draw their own conclusions about it? Well, they struggled with the balance of these two perspectives, and so what you get is the development of boards of overseers who tended to see themselves, they were largely drawn from commerce and industry, and they saw themselves as the protectors of collegiate virtue. And they tended to view professors as a band of invaders with their notions of free inquiry and so forth. So beginning at that period of time, there's a kind of an ongoing tension between free inquiry and the control of exploration and discussion of ideas, so that you, in effect, don't corrupt the youth. During the latter part of the 19th century, this tension grew to a point where things began to become out of balance, essentially. This is a result of the development of a lot of religious colleges in the United States, religious revival movements, and the development of fundamentalism. All began to put increasing pressure on the college climate to lean more toward the area of indoctrination and avoiding unpopular or controversial ideas. And so in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, a lot of college and university professors were dismissed simply for teaching unpopular ideas.
Can we interject there at this point too? Because you've brought us into the 20th century, and as we talked before the program, that really around the 1920s is when it became, can I say, more formalized and structured. And I believe that the AAUP, which is the American Association of University Professors, helped bring that up. So I guess I'll do this two ways. Would you tell us about that structure in the 20th century? But the professors who brought that in, I believe they were influenced by trips to Europe?
Yes, in the latter part of the 19th century, during the later Industrial Revolution, a lot of American academics were living and studying and doing research in German universities. And the German universities prided themselves on being the real havens of free inquiry because of the premium that the Industrial Revolution put on science and technology and research. Free and open inquiry was an absolute must, and they just didn't feel like you could call yourself a college or a university without academic freedom.
Tom, can I ask, do they couch that in the terms of tenure or?
Not yet, not yet. I believe tenure is probably an American invention in that sense. But these professors returned home and found this climate of a kind of thought control over free inquiry in the universities. And so they banded together and essentially formed a union, the American Association of University Professors, in 1915. And it was out of the activities of this union that the concept of tenure, as applied to education, was developed and established as a legal mechanism to protect academic freedom from the dominance of political and religious propaganda, essentially, is what happened. And then in the 1940s, the AAUP published a definitive statement about academic freedom and tenure, which has now become the baseline for case law in issues of academic freedom and tenure.
So both at the university level, where you actually have policies adopted by the boards, and there's even references in state law, and in the court cases. So it's pretty well laid out, and therefore when cases arise that are issues, we no longer are dealing only with custom and tradition, as you were talking about in Europe, but there are specifics.
That's right. There are now in place fairly precise definitions and specific rights and responsibilities associated with academic freedom that are protected. Again, the concern of tenure primarily is the prevention of arbitrary and retaliatory dismissal of faculty based on administrators or trustees' distaste for the content of teaching or research that's going on. Academic freedom then, also tenure guarantees due process. When faculty's conduct or research or whatever is challenged, they are entitled to due process, and all of this is fairly clearly spelled out through precedent and case law as various challenges have come down the road over time.
Janelle Burke.
Can you explain what a typical tenure program might look like at a secondary or a higher education institution? What might a typical tenure policy include?
Well, it's usually going to include some sort of statement about academic freedom, and it will also usually have some sort of procedure for the review of faculty. Traditionally, it's been a period of 4 to 7 years where faculty are reviewed after their initial hire, and then they're granted tenure for the duration of their voluntary stay at that institution. And in the absence of cause, college should expect to employ faculty until they retire, unless they decide of their own choice to move on.
But it is not an automatic thing that you just get because you're hired. You don't automatically get tenure.
No.
You have to earn tenure.
You have to earn it. There are definite procedures that you have to follow in order to get it. That will vary according to the setting. It's different in a community college than it is in a university, where we're not more concerned with teaching issues than research. So we're not under the publish or perish mandate that would be a requirement for tenure. At a university, our mandate for doing community service is somewhat lesser at community colleges than it is at universities also. And then in some institutions, tenure is regularly reviewed. It was that case in NIC until very recently. You had to renew your tenure every few years, rather than having it granted for life unless you commit certain offenses where tenure doesn't protect you.
And tenure is generally applied to full-time teachers, is that correct?
That's correct. It would not apply. It's a difficult issue because academic freedom is as important for part-time instructors as it is for full-time instructors, but in fact they are not protected by tenure because their contracts are only on a year-to-year basis and they never get tenure.
Does tenure grow out of the contract principle, or is it another principle, would you say?
I think it grows out primarily out of the principle of academic freedom, which we might want to spend a couple of minutes laying out a little bit more about the rights and responsibilities. There are certain values that are fundamental to academic freedom, which are active discourse, critical debate, free exchange of ideas, and communication of values, as well as at least the right to responsibly speak off campus and responsible activities and action off campus, so that our constitutional rights are not particularly restricted. And essentially what academic freedom does is to define the role of the teaching profession by describing the legal rights and responsibilities that apply to faculty. And the specific rights involved are the control of the curriculum, control of course content, the pursuit of controversial research and scholarship, including the content and the methodology used in that research, although there are certain limiting areas. For example, research on human beings or animals is going to be overseen by peer review boards of examiners, so that we're not doing Frankenstein sorts of things in the context of the college. Also, the entitlement to publish our research and ideas that are related to our field of expertise, and being able to hold and express religious and political beliefs. So those are the rights that academic freedom is aimed to protect. On the other hand, with rights always go responsibilities, and it's important to understand what tenure doesn't protect. And it doesn't protect incompetence, for example. And a large part of the review of faculty before they get tenure is to make sure that they are competent in the classroom and in their research areas. Also, faculty are required to at least adequately perform all of their contractual duties, and it's in that area where duties are spelled out in contracts that tenure is connected to the idea of contractual obligations also. Teachers also are not really entitled to engage in the discussion of controversial subject matter that's outside of the subject that they're teaching. So if you're teaching
in the classroom.
In the classroom, that's right. Otherwise you're not teaching your subject matter, and then that would become a competence issue. So you can't go into a classroom in mathematics and justify a political harangue against the Democrats or the Republicans or something, because that would simply be inappropriate to the subject matter of the course, and it's just making a connection there would be too much of a stretch. Also, faculty are not allowed to, as they wouldn't be in any workplace, to be belligerent or uncooperative or insubordinate in the performance of their regular duties. And tenure isn't going to protect somebody from getting out of hand that way. It's to protect academic freedom and not protect somebody's job no matter what they do. Also, faculty are not permitted to disrupt the mission of the college. So if you go out and incite a riot or set up a political rally, as happened in the Vietnam era, teachers took a lot of risk when they were involved in political rallies during the 60s, because they were essentially committing civil disobedience, because their tenure was not protected by those kinds of outside activities that were disruptive of the mission of the college, which is teaching. Finally, tenure doesn't protect what's come to be known as moral turpitude or acts of immorality. And those this is a fuzzy area, but if you're committing some sort of questionable moral act that impairs or impedes the performance of your job, tenure won't protect you against that. So, for example, having illicit sexual affairs with one's immediate students is considered out of bounds and disruptive of the classroom environment's the sense of fairness and justice and so forth, that people aren't getting special privileges and so on and so forth.
And also criminal acts, of course, if one's
Sure.
convicted of a felony.
Absolutely.
And another thing that we want to get up in the time we have on this particular part of the program, also if there's an economic crisis, if you'd address that, where there's going to have to be a cutback, there's a drop in enrollment of students and so forth.
That's right. The problem, of course, is that there's no justification for protecting someone's job on the basis of academic freedom if the college does not have the financial resources to support the program that job is in. And if that's really the case, and we have real fiscal belt tightening and we have to eliminate some programs, then tenure isn't going to protect somebody from that. There's just nothing anybody can do. The issue is that it's not too unusual for that fiscal belt tightening or reduction in force to be used as a pretext to get rid of controversial teachers that they really want to get rid of on other grounds. So you have to really be able to justify the the fiscal constraint and show that that really is the reason and that it isn't something else, that the teacher is irritating the administration or teaching unpopular ideas or engaging in controversial activities that they would otherwise be protected by academic freedom.
Two other things from my part before I go back to Janelle, and one of them is one more thing in this area that relates to dismissal that you're talking about. Then I want to get into the due process question. But during the early 1950s, during the McCarthy problems in that era of time, a lot of professors lost their positions. I believe you indicated from your research about 77 in the United States.
The AAUP has documented 77 professors that lost their jobs specifically for teaching unpopular ideas in the classroom during anything that smacked of communism in the McCarthy period was thought to be subversive and anti-American. And this, of course, is absolutely chilling to academic freedom. If you can't even explain communism to people in the classroom, and furthermore, professors, if we think of the classical notion of to profess, it means to advocate for, professors are not required to be unbiased. They are allowed to advocate communism or socialism or Nazism or anything they want, provided that the students are provided the opportunity to hear opposing viewpoints and that their grades are not held hostage to agreeing with the professor's position on the matter. As long as it's truly free and open discussion in the classroom, professors are free to advocate points of view so long as other points of view are heard and that students can freely express their views without fear of punishment either.
Mm-hmm. On the question of due process, certainly there have been, as you've indicated, a number of cases and disputes all around the country, and so we know that both in the written documents on tenure and in the court cases that part of this process is that when this conflict arises, that the individual involved does have a right to due process. Would you explain somewhat how that operates and is guaranteed in the program?
Well, I'm not too well informed probably about the specifics of due process as it relates to law. The main notion, though, is that it protects, it's a set of procedures that ensure that there is a genuine and unbiased inquiry into the charges leveled against the professor or instructor, that indeed they are violating principles of things to do with incompetence or moral turpitude or insubordination, that it really is things like that. And so there are various mechanisms that are made to ensure that that process occurs and that the burden of proof resides with the institution to prove that the faculty member is incompetent or insubordinate or immoral or something like that, illegitimately disruptive, and that the faculty member has the opportunity to present his or her position with attorneys present and so forth. On the other hand, when the institution does establish legitimate cause that isn't covered by protections of academic freedom by tenure, case law does tend to support the institution and its dismissal of the faculty member. Mm-hmm. And after all, we don't want to have genuinely mean-spirited and belligerent and incompetent faculty protected for life somehow when they're not really doing their jobs. Okay, so it cuts both ways.
Janelle Burt.
Before we go to my main question, I want to ask you a question with regard to a subject that we were talking about just moments ago, and that is when professors in their classrooms set forth a number of different ideas. I think sometimes people believe that professors are particularly supporting one idea when in fact they are simply putting forth a number of ideas. allowing students to make their own decisions with regard to that. And I think that's a very important part of academic freedom. That's simply a comment, I think, and you can expound upon that if you wish, and then I'll ask you the main question.
Sure. Well, I'll just take it from my own point of view. As a teacher of philosophy, that is a subject matter that deals with a lot of controversial opinions, what we want students to do is to be exposed to these different opinions and the pros and cons of those opinions precisely so that they can make up their own minds about them and come to well-informed and well-reasoned decisions about the values and ideas that are important to them. So as a teacher, though I may feel free to express a preference for a point of view myself, I certainly respect the students' right to form their own preferences.
And that's very important to the art of critical thinking they're going to need later on in their lives. My main question, however, has to do with the fact that although tenure centers around academic freedom, and that's the heart of tenure, there are other very good reasons to have a tenure system, such as stability of the institution and so forth. Can you very quickly, in the small amount of time that we have left, maybe talk about some of the other advantages to a tenure system?
Well, of course, it does. You don't want to be hiring and firing faculty on the whim of public opinion as it changes almost from day to day, or on the basis of the personal perspectives of administrators or trustees. You would have very little continuity in the curriculum and in the course of instruction if you did that. It would become quite chaotic, and students would not feel confident that they were having a very reliable or viable educational experience in that kind of climate. And while tenure doesn't apply to students, academic freedom applies to students as much as it does to teachers. They are entitled to hear these ideas that may be unpopular and to disagree with them and express their own opinions without fear of punishment from grades and so on and so forth. So our evaluation system of students and that we're evaluating students' work and not punishing them for what they think is at stake here in terms of the integrity of the institution.
On that note, I have to bring the program to conclusion. On behalf of Janelle Burke and our staff, Tom Flint from the Department of Philosophy at North Idaho College, we thank you for being here today to discuss the issue of tenure, its history, and the components of tenure in higher education. And I want to say that you have been very, very informative, and we've enjoyed the program very much.
I have as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will be with us again next week at this same time when we will move to yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.